The courthouse doors closed behind me with a sound that felt heavier than it should have, like metal sealing off an entire chapter of my life. I sat inside my car in the parking lot, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at the divorce papers lying on the passenger seat. 28 years of marriage reduced to a stack of stamped pages and legal signatures. I wasn't crying. That surprised me more than anything. I wasn't relieved either. What I felt was exhaustion, the kind that settles deep into your bones after carrying weight for too long. My phone rang. I glanced down at the screen, expecting it to be my attorney confirming something final, something procedural. Instead, the name glowing on the screen made my stomach tighten. Margaret Whitmore, my ex-mother-in-law. For a moment, I considered letting it ring, letting it fade into silence like everything else I was trying to leave behind. But something inside me, a quiet instinct sharpened by years of survival, told me to answer. I pressed accept and lifted the phone to my ear. She didn't greet me, didn't ask how I was, didn't even pretend to acknowledge what had just happened inside that courthouse. Her voice came through cold and steady. Make sure you send $9,000 this month. Same as always. There was a pause, not from her, but from me, a silence that stretched just long enough for my heartbeat to echo inside my ears. $9,000. Same as always. For years. That phrase had controlled my life more than any calendar, more than any paycheck, more than any promise I had ever made. And yet, instead of anger rising in my chest, something else happened. I smiled. Slowly. Coldly. Did you know your son is drowning in debt? Silence. Not the polite silence she used when she disapproved of something. Not the irritated silence she used when I disappointed her. This was different. This silence had weight. This silence had fear inside it. I lowered the phone slightly, staring through the windshield at the empty parking lot. A few cars rolled past in the distance. Ordinary people continuing their ordinary lives. Meanwhile, mine had just shifted in a way they could never imagine. For 28 years, I had been the reliable one, the responsible one, the quiet solution to every financial crisis that whispered its way into our family. And now, for the first time, I held something they didn't expect. Information. Truth. Power. The call ended without another word from her. No argument. No threat. Just silence and a sharp disconnect that echoed louder than any shouting match ever could. I sat there for several seconds, the phone still in my hand, my reflection staring back at me in the rearview mirror. I barely recognized that woman. Not because she looked different, though the faint lines around my eyes told stories I rarely spoke aloud, but because something inside her had changed. Inside the courthouse minutes earlier, the judge had looked directly at me before delivering his final words. His expression had been calm, professional, neutral, but there had been something else behind his eyes, something observant, almost knowing, as if he understood there was more beneath the paperwork than signatures and settlements, as if he suspected this story wasn't over. I reached toward the passenger seat and lifted the stack of divorce documents into my lap. The pages felt heavier than paper should. Legal language filled the margins, percentages, divisions. Liabilities, all carefully negotiated over months of tense meetings and quiet strategy. The divorce had been finalized cleanly. No alimony payments required. No shared obligations left unresolved. Everything had been settled according to the law. At least, that's what I had believed. I flipped through the pages slowly, my fingers tracing along the edges, trying to steady the rising tension building in my chest. Same as always. Her words replayed in my mind, looping over and over again like an old recording stuck on repeat. Same as always. Not thank you. Not please. Not even consideration. Just expectation. For years, I had sent those monthly transfers without question. At first, they were framed as temporary help, a few months to support the family business during difficult times. That was how it began. Temporary. Temporary had a way of becoming permanent when no one dared to question it. Even during months when my own savings felt thin, even when unexpected expenses piled up. Even when I lay awake at night calculating numbers in my head until morning arrived, I still sent the money. Because family took care of family. That was what they always said. That was what I had believed. I leaned back in my seat and exhaled slowly, trying to calm the tightness in my chest. Outside, the sky had begun to shift into a dull afternoon gray. Clouds gathered quietly overhead, thick and unmoving. The world looked still, too still. As I adjusted the stack of papers in my lap, something slipped loose from between the pages and fell against my thigh. A sealed envelope. I froze. For a moment, I simply stared at it, unsure how it had ended up there. The envelope was plain, off-white, slightly creased along the edges, as if it had been tucked into the paperwork without my noticing. My name was written across the front, but the handwriting didn't look familiar. Not my attorney's. Not mine. Not anyone I recognized. A slow unease crept up my spine as I picked it up between my fingers. The paper felt heavier than it should have, as if whatever waited inside carried more than ink and information. I turned it over. Still sealed. Still untouched. How long had this been sitting inside my documents without me noticing? Why had no one mentioned it? The parking lot around me remained quiet. A faint breeze brushed against the car windows, rattling dry leaves across the asphalt. For a moment, I considered placing the envelope back into the stack, pretending I hadn't seen it, pretending none of this existed. I had ignored warning signs before, ignored doubts, ignored instincts, ignored the quiet voice inside me that whispered when something didn't feel right. Not this time. Not anymore. My fingers trembled slightly as I tore open the edge of the envelope. The paper ripped with a soft tearing sound that echoed inside the silent car. I slid the contents out slowly. A single sheet of printed paper. Formal formatting. Bank letterhead at the top. My breath caught as my eyes dropped to the first bold word printed across the page. Loan. 5 years before the divorce. Mornings in our kitchen followed the same quiet rhythm. Coffee brewing. Bills spread across the wooden table. My laptop glowing faintly in the early light while the rest of the house still slept. I sat there most mornings before work, sorting through numbers while the world felt manageable and predictable. Numbers had always made sense to me. They followed rules. They respected logic. They didn't hide secrets unless someone forced them to. That morning, the air smelled like dark roast coffee and toasted bread. I remember because it felt like such an ordinary day, the kind you never expect to become the beginning of something that will later unravel your entire life. The back door opened behind me. My husband walked in, already dressed, his tie slightly crooked and his shoulders tight with tension. He didn't greet me, didn't kiss my cheek the way he used to when we were younger. Instead, he walked straight to the counter and poured himself coffee without looking at me. Then he spoke. We need to send money to my parents this month. No good morning. No small talk. Just money. I turned slowly in my chair and watched him carefully. His voice carried an urgency I hadn't heard before. Tight. Impatient. Rehearsed? How much? I asked. He hesitated. Just long enough to make me notice. 5,000, he said. That number felt larger than what I had expected, but still manageable. At the time, $5,000 was not impossible for us. I had worked for years building financial stability, carefully saving, carefully planning. Is everything okay? I asked. He rubbed his forehead with his fingers, sighing heavily. The business is struggling, he said. Just temporary. They'll recover in a few months. Temporary? That word carried comfort. Temporary meant short-term. Temporary meant manageable. Temporary meant this wouldn't become routine. At least, that's what I told myself. Helping family felt natural. Questioning family felt wrong. So I logged into our bank account and made the transfer that same morning. I remember hovering over the confirmation button for a few seconds before clicking it. Not because I didn't trust him, but because the amount felt larger than what we normally moved around casually. Still, I pressed confirm. The screen flashed green. Transfer complete. At the time, I believed I had done the right thing. The next month, he asked again. This time, the amount was smaller. 3,000? He explained that payroll had run late. A supplier needed payment. A machine had broken unexpectedly. There was always a reason. There was always urgency. And each time, the requests sounded reasonable enough to justify. What began as 5,000 slowly turned into routine movement of money. Month after month. Small increases that blended into our budget until they no longer felt unusual. At first, his parents thanked me. His mother called personally after the second transfer. "We appreciate your help," she said warmly. "Family takes care of family." Her voice carried affection. Approval. The kind that made me feel included. Valued. Needed. But over time, the tone shifted. Gratitude faded. Expectation replaced it. Eventually, they stopped thanking me altogether. They began speaking as if the money had always belonged to them. One afternoon, I overheard his mother speaking on speakerphone while my husband stood nearby. "Thank you for taking care of us," she told him. Him. Not me. I stood in the doorway listening, holding a folder in my hands, waiting for him to correct her. He didn't. He simply nodded and smiled as if the praise belonged to him. That moment stayed with me longer than I admitted to anyone. Years passed, and the business never seemed to improve. There was always another problem, another delay, another emergency requiring financial support, medical expenses, equipment breakdowns, staffing shortages. Excuses rotated like seasons. But the results never changed. No matter how much we helped, the company remained unstable. I never saw formal reports, never reviewed balance sheets, never received updates detailed enough to satisfy the part of me that worked professionally with numbers every single day. Whenever I asked for specifics, my husband would wave off my concerns. "We're getting there," he would say casually. Those words began to feel empty. One evening, months after the transfers had become routine, I sat alone reviewing our banking history after dinner. It had become a habit of mine, double-checking numbers, making sure everything aligned. Scrolling through transaction records, I paused on one entry, a transfer confirmation. The amount was larger than usual, but that wasn't what stopped me. It was the receiving account name. I stared at the screen, blinking once, then twice. The name didn't match the family business. It didn't match his parents. It didn't match any vendor or supplier I recognized. It was unfamiliar. A personal name I had never heard before. My chest tightened slightly. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Possibly a subcontractor? Possibly an internal account used by the business. Still, something didn't feel right. The numbers didn't lie, but sometimes they whispered before they shouted. I leaned closer to the screen, reading the name again, committing it silently to memory. Just then, footsteps echoed down the hallway behind me. My husband entered the room. The timing felt too precise to ignore. He glanced at the laptop screen, then at me. "What are you doing?" he asked. His tone wasn't curious. It was cautious. "I was just reviewing the account," I said casually. "Who is this transfer to?" I turned the laptop slightly so he could see. For a brief moment, something flickered across his face, too quick to define, but strong enough to notice. Then it disappeared. "It's just business logistics," he said quickly. "You wouldn't understand." The words landed harder than they should have. You wouldn't understand. I had spent my career managing financial records more complex than anything his family business had ever handled. And yet, in that moment, he dismissed my question as if I were naive. Before I could respond, he reached forward and closed the laptop lid. Too fast. Too deliberate. The sound of it snapping shut echoed louder than expected. Silence filled the room. I watched him carefully, waiting for him to say more, to explain, to reassure, to clarify. He didn't. Instead, he turned and walked away without another word. That night, I lay awake long after the house fell silent. The unfamiliar name lingered in my thoughts. I kept replaying the moment in my mind, the way he reacted, the way he shut the laptop, the way he avoided explaining. I told myself I was overthinking, that it was nothing. That trust required patience. But before I went to bed, I quietly reopened the laptop, scrolled back to the transaction, and saved the receipt. I didn't tell him. Months later, I reopened that saved file again, zoomed in on the receiving details, and that was when I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The receiving account wasn't registered to a business. It was registered to an individual, not a company, not a corporation, a person, and in that moment, I realized something that I hadn't been ready to admit before. This had never been just about helping family. I stared at the word printed across the top of the document until the letters began to blur together. Loan. The inside of my car felt smaller suddenly, as if the air had thickened around me. Outside, the courthouse parking lot remained quiet, ordinary, unaware that something inside my life had just shifted in a way I couldn't yet understand. I unfolded the paper completely and held it with both hands, trying to steady the faint trembling in my fingers. The bank's letterhead sat neatly across the top of the page. Beneath it, rows of typed information stretched down the page: numbers, dates, account identifiers. At first glance, none of it made sense. Then my eyes landed on a number printed near the center of the page. A balance amount? I blinked once, then leaned closer. It was far larger than anything I had ever personally borrowed. Larger than any mortgage payment. Larger than any personal expense I could remember agreeing to. My throat tightened. Slowly, I traced the lines of text downward until I found the name listed beneath the account holder section. My name, Marissa Holt. For a moment, my brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. I read it again. Still there. Still mine. A hollow feeling settled deep in my chest as I scanned the next line. Loan opening date. 2 years earlier. 2 years? I leaned back in the driver's seat, staring at the ceiling of the car as memory began scrambling through my thoughts. 2 years ago had been a normal year, busy, structured, predictable. I had been working full-time, maintaining our accounts, handling taxes, planning expenses. There had been no major purchases, no sudden financial decisions, no visits to banks for new loans, nothing that even remotely matched what this document described. I lowered my gaze back to the paper. Mistakes like this didn't happen accidentally. Not with banks. Not with numbers. Numbers followed rules, which meant something here had broken those rules. I reached for my phone again, this time with purpose, and dialed the customer service number printed along the bottom of the page. The automated voice answered immediately. Calm and mechanical. Thank you for calling. Please listen carefully as our menu options have recently changed. I pressed the necessary buttons, navigating through layers of recorded instructions. Each beep felt slower than the last, as if time itself had decided to drag its feet. Finally, after several long seconds, a human voice answered. Good afternoon. How may I assist you? My name is Marissa Holt, I said carefully. I'm calling regarding a loan account listed under my name. I need verification. There was a brief pause on the other end, longer than what felt routine. Of course. Ma'am? The representative replied. Can you provide the reference number listed on your document? I read the numbers aloud, my voice steady even as unease crept deeper into my chest. More typing sounds followed. Then silence. Not short silence. Not ordinary silence. A pause long enough to make my grip tighten around the phone. Yes, ma'am. The representative finally said, The account is active. Active. The word echoed louder than it should have. Active. I repeated. Yes, ma'am. This loan is currently listed under your name. My stomach dropped. I closed my eyes for a moment, pressing my fingers against my temple. I don't remember authorizing this, I said slowly. Can you confirm the borrower details? Another pause. Yes, ma'am, she replied. You are listed as the primary borrower. Primary borrower. Not cosigner. Not secondary. Primary. The weight of that word settled into my chest like stone. I see, I whispered. My voice sounded distant to my own ears. Is there another name associated with the account? I asked. More typing. More silence. Yes, the representative said. There is a secondary contact listed. My heartbeat quickened. And that name is? The answer came without hesitation. My husband's name. The air left my lungs in a slow, silent exhale. I opened my eyes and stared at the dashboard in front of me, trying to align memory with information. 2 years ago. I replayed that time in my mind. Birthdays. Work deadlines. Holiday dinners. Ordinary evenings spent folding laundry while television noise filled the background. There had been no meeting at a bank. No signing appointment. No paperwork laid across a desk. Nothing. I would have remembered. I remembered every tax form I had ever signed. Every mortgage paper. Every financial agreement. Something this large, something this serious, could not simply vanish from memory. And yet, here it was. Real. Documented. Binding. I ended the call slowly and lowered the phone into my lap. For several seconds, I remained motionless, listening to the quiet hum of distant traffic outside the parking lot. My hands rested on the document, fingers pressing lightly into the paper as if holding it down might somehow keep reality from shifting any further. But instinct pushed me forward. There was one more place I needed to go. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, driving without hesitation toward a small office building across town, a place I hadn't visited in months. Daniel Reeves's financial consulting office. He had helped review our investments years earlier, offering advice when we were planning retirement strategies. Calm, methodical, precise, the kind of man who respected numbers the same way I did. When I stepped inside his office, the faint scent of paper and polished wood filled the air. He looked up from behind his desk the moment I entered. His expression shifted instantly, not because of the paperwork in my hand, but because of my face. "You look like something's wrong," he said carefully. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I walked forward and placed the document gently on his desk. "I need you to look at this," I said. He adjusted his glasses and lifted the paper, scanning the contents slowly. The room fell silent except for the soft rustle of paper moving between his fingers. He read the first page. Then he read it again, this time more slowly. His brow tightened slightly. A subtle reaction, but enough to make the air feel heavier. Finally, he looked up. "Did you personally sign this loan?" he asked. "No," I answered immediately. Not hesitation. Not uncertainty. "No." He held my gaze for a moment, then looked back down at the document. "This may involve unauthorized financial activity," he said carefully. He didn't use the word fraud, but I saw it reflected in his eyes. He turned the page slightly and tapped a section near the bottom with his finger. "There's something else," he said. I leaned forward. There, at the bottom of the page, sat a signature line, my name written in cursive. But the handwriting, it wasn't mine. I leaned closer to the desk. My eyes locked on the signature as if staring long enough might make it change. The ink had faded slightly along the edges, like it had been pressed too lightly into the paper. At first glance, it looked like mine, the same looping M, the same long tail on the final letter. But something about it felt wrong, forced, hesitant. It looked like someone trying to remember my handwriting instead of naturally forming it. I reached into my purse and pulled out an older document, my last tax filing. My fingers moved automatically. Practiced from years of organizing paperwork. "Here," I said quietly, sliding it across the desk. Daniel took both documents and placed them side by side. The difference became obvious the moment they sat next to each other. My real signature flowed smoothly, the curves natural. The letters connected without hesitation. The one on the loan document felt stiff, uneven, slightly cramped, as if the person writing it had paused too often. "This doesn't look consistent," Daniel said carefully. He didn't say the word I feared most, forgery. But he didn't dismiss the possibility either. I stared at both signatures, my chest tightening with every second that passed. Memories began flooding into my mind, years of signing mortgage papers, investment agreements, insurance forms. I had never signed anything casually, never rushed through documents without reading every line. That had always been my habit, my protection, which meant if this signature wasn't mine, someone had signed for me. A cold wave of realization moved through my body, settling deep in my stomach. Daniel flipped to the second page in the loan file, scanning the printed information carefully. His expression shifted slightly, not panic, not shock, but something sharper. Concern. "Look at this," he said. I leaned closer. Near the bottom of the page sat a list of reference numbers tied to the original loan account. Several of them, not just one. More numbers, more accounts. My heart skipped. "What are those?" I asked. "Linked loan references," he replied. Linked. Plural. He turned toward his computer and began typing quickly, pulling up records connected to the numbers listed on the document. The room fell into silence except for the soft tapping of keys. Seconds stretched into something longer. Then the screen changed. Daniel leaned forward slightly. 3 loan entries appeared on the monitor, all connected to variations of my name. Not just one. 3. My mouth went dry. "That can't be right," I whispered. But the numbers remained unchanged. 3 separate loans. 3 separate balances. All tied to my identity. Daniel didn't speak immediately. Instead, he reached for a notepad and began calculating quietly, adding totals together with slow, deliberate movements. He wrote the final number down, then slid the paper toward me. I stared at it. For several seconds, my mind refused to process what I was seeing. The total was massive, far beyond anything I could handle alone, far beyond anything that could be ignored or explained away. My fingers trembled slightly against the edge of the desk. "If these default," Daniel began slowly. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I understood. My financial future could collapse overnight. "Have you discussed this with your husband?" he asked. I shook my head immediately. No. The word left my mouth faster than I expected. Not because I trusted him, but because deep down, I feared what he might say if confronted. Daniel nodded once, as if my answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "You need legal advice?" he said firmly. "Not just financial. Legal." The word landed heavily. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small business card, writing a name across the back before handing it to me. "Linda Carver," he said. "She specializes in financial liability cases." I took the card and stared at the printed letters. Linda Carver, attorney at law. The drive to her office felt longer than it should have, even though the distance was short. Every traffic light felt slower. Every turn felt heavier. By the time I stepped inside her office, my chest felt tight with something I couldn't fully name yet. Fear. The waiting room smelled faintly of polished wood and paper. Clean. Professional. Controlled. When Linda Carver stepped into the room to greet me, her posture was straight, her expression calm but alert. She led me into her office and sat across from me without wasting time. "Tell me what's happening," she said. I handed her the documents. She read them carefully, her face unreadable. No shock, no surprise, just focus. Her calmness unsettled me more than panic would have. She reached the signature page and paused. "Did you authorize these loans?" she asked. "No," I said. She nodded once. "This may constitute financial fraud." There it was. The word finally spoken out loud. Fraud. Not suspicion. Not confusion. Fraud. The room felt colder suddenly. Linda flipped to another section of the paperwork and pointed to a paragraph I had barely noticed earlier. Collateral. This section lists shared marital property, she explained. Savings accounts. Investment holdings. Potential retirement assets. My stomach twisted. If payments stop, she continued, these assets could be targeted, even after divorce. even after separation. The consequences could still reach me. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay steady. "Who had access to your financial records?" she asked. The answer came instantly. "My husband." The silence that followed felt heavier than accusation. Linda leaned back slightly in her chair, studying the documents again. "We need to request the original loan files," she said. "All of them." "All of them?" I repeated. "Yes." Her voice remained steady, professional, unshaken. "If these signatures were forged," she added carefully, "we may be looking at years of unauthorized activity." Years. The word echoed louder than anything else. I sat there in silence, staring at the paperwork spread across her desk, feeling the weight of realization pressing deeper into my chest. This wasn't a single mistake. Not an accident. Not a misunderstanding. It was a system. And somehow, without realizing it, I had been living inside it for years. The waiting was worse than the discovery. Days passed after Linda submitted the official request for the original loan files, and each morning felt heavier than the last. I checked my phone more often than I cared to admit, waiting for updates that never seemed to come fast enough. Sleep became shallow, restless. Every night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying numbers in my mind like they were pieces of a puzzle I couldn't yet solve. Loan dates, account balances, signature lines that didn't belong to me. The longer the bank delayed sending the records, the more my unease grew. "They're taking longer than usual," Linda admitted during one of our calls. "How long should this normally take?" I asked. "A few days," she said. It had already been over a week. That alone was enough to keep my nerves stretched tight. Then, one gray morning, everything changed. Rain tapped steadily against the tall office windows when I walked into Linda's building. The sky outside was heavy with clouds, casting dull shadows across the polished floor. The receptionist looked up as I entered. "There's a package for you," she said. My pulse quickened. On the front desk sat a thick envelope, heavier than anything I had expected. A courier label stretched across the front, stamped with official banking insignia. Even before touching it, I knew this was what we had been waiting for. Linda joined me moments later, her expression calm but alert. "This is it," she said quietly. We carried the envelope into her office together. The rain outside intensified, striking the windows in steady bursts as she placed the package carefully on her desk. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she opened it. Inside were multiple folders, thick, organized, labeled with loan identification numbers printed neatly across their tabs. More than 3. More than what we had originally identified. My chest tightened. "That's more than expected," I said softly. Linda didn't respond immediately. She began sorting through the folders, stacking them in careful rows across her desk. One by one, the sound of paper sliding across wood filled the room. She opened the first folder. Inside lay loan documents, formal, structured, unmistakable. But it wasn't the loan itself that caught my attention. It was the address listed in the collateral section. An unfamiliar street name. Not our home. Not any property I recognized. "Do you know this address?" Linda asked. I leaned forward, scanning the printed lines carefully. "No, nothing about it looked familiar. I've never seen it before," I said. Linda turned toward her computer and began searching public property records. Within seconds, a listing appeared on the screen. Then photographs loaded. The image took a moment to sharpen fully. A house. White exterior. Wide front porch. Decorative stone columns. My breath caught in my throat. I knew that house. Not from paperwork. From memory. Flashbacks hit me instantly, a holiday gathering years earlier. Christmas lights wrapped around the railing. Laughter spilling from open doors. Plates of food carried into crowded rooms. That wasn't just any house. It belonged to my husband's parents. I felt my stomach drop. "That's their house," I whispered. Linda turned toward me slowly. "You're certain?" Yes. There was no doubt. I had stood on that porch, Sat at that dining table. Complimented the renovations myself. The renovations. A new kitchen. Updated floors. Fresh paint. At the time, I had admired the improvements without questioning where the money had come from. Now, the timeline shifted in my mind. Loan issued. Renovations completed. Celebrations held. Not coincidence. Pattern. Linda scrolled further through the records. "Look at this," she said. A line item showed renovation expenses completed shortly after the loan was issued. My chest tightened. I wasn't helping them survive. I was financing their comfort. The realization landed harder than anything before it. Linda reached for another folder. "Let's check the next one." She opened it carefully. Another address appeared. Different location. Different town. Same pattern. Property listed. Loan issued. Collateral tied to my name? "This isn't just one property," Linda said quietly. My pulse quickened. "How many?" I asked. She hesitated. "Not long, but long enough." Then she scanned the remaining folders again, reviewing each carefully. "There are at least 2 confirmed properties," she said. At least. Those words echoed loudly in my mind. 2 properties. 2 investments. 2 entire homes connected to money I never agreed to borrow. My hands rested motionless in my lap. But inside, everything felt like it was shifting. "Total number of loans?" I asked. Linda inhaled slowly, then answered. "More than we initially thought." She didn't give the number immediately. Instead, she pulled out her notepad again and began writing. One total after another. Adding. Rechecking. Verifying. The room felt smaller with every passing second. When she finished, she turned the notepad toward me. I stared down at the final total. My throat tightened. The number was staggering. Not just threatening. Destroying. Without legal intervention. There was no scenario where I could survive that kind of financial burden. None. My mind drifted backward suddenly, to a memory I hadn't thought about in years. A holiday dinner. My mother-in-law proudly showing off her renovated kitchen, her hands resting on polished marble countertops. "Isn't it beautiful?" she had asked. I remembered smiling, complimenting the design, admiring the lighting fixtures. Now I saw it differently. That kitchen had been funded by money borrowed under my name. Money I never agreed to give. I swallowed hard, forcing myself back into the present. Linda flipped to another section of the documents, scanning the authorization signatures carefully. Then she paused. Her finger hovered over a line of text. "Look here," she said. I leaned closer. There, beneath supporting authorization records, appeared additional names tied to the loan documentation. One of them made my heart skip. Margaret Whitmore, my mother-in-law. The air left my lungs in a slow, unsteady breath. She wasn't just benefiting. She was involved, not indirectly, not unknowingly, directly. For years, they had called me family, shared meals with me, celebrated holidays beside me, all while quietly building their lives on debt I never agreed to carry. Linda closed the folder slowly. "We need to prepare for confrontation," she said. Her voice was calm, measured, professional. But inside me, something had shifted permanently. This wasn't confusion anymore. This wasn't uncertainty. This was betrayal. And the next step would force the truth into the open, whether they were ready for it or not. That night, I spread every document across my dining table and stared at them until the fear inside me began to change shape. For days, fear had controlled my breathing, my thoughts, my sleep. It whispered worst-case scenarios into the quiet hours of the night and replayed memories I wished I could forget. But sitting there under the dim light of the kitchen lamp, surrounded by stacks of loan agreements and property records, something shifted. Fear alone wouldn't protect me. Understanding would. Control would. I pulled a yellow legal pad toward me and began organizing everything into piles. Loan agreements in one stack, property ownership records in another, signature samples in a third. Each page carried proof of something I had never agreed to. Each line told a story I hadn't been allowed to read until now. I moved slowly, carefully, marking suspicious dates with sticky notes and circling numbers that appeared more than once. Patterns began to surface the longer I stared at the timeline. Loan issued. Property renovated. Family gathering hosted. I froze when I noticed the first clear match. One loan date aligned perfectly with my father-in-law's birthday celebration from years earlier. I remembered that night vividly. A crowded dining room. Laughter filling the house. New appliances shining under bright kitchen lights. At the time, I had admired the renovations. Now, I understood them. That kitchen hadn't been a sign of success. It had been built on debt, my debt. I sat back in my chair and exhaled slowly, pressing my fingers against my temples. For years, I had believed those celebrations were moments of family unity. Now they looked like milestones in a financial timeline I had never authorized. I reached for my phone and opened a blank message to my ex-husband. My fingers moved quickly at first. "We need to talk." "What did you do? Why is my name on these loans?" The words came easily, sharp, emotional, fueled by anger that had been building for days. Then I stopped. My thumb hovered above the send button. I stared at the message, reading it again. If I sent it now, everything would explode immediately. They would deny it, deflect it, destroy evidence if necessary. Reacting too early would hand them control. Slowly, I deleted every word. The empty message screen felt strangely powerful. For the first time, silence felt stronger than confrontation. Instead of texting him, I called Linda. She answered on the second ring. "I was just reviewing everything," I said. "I want to confront them." "Not yet," she replied calmly. Her tone carried certainty, not hesitation. "We move strategically," she continued. "Do not reveal what you know until we are fully prepared." I leaned forward slightly, gripping the phone tighter. "So what do I do now?" "Document everything," she said. "Every call, every message, every request." Her words settled into place inside my mind like instructions in a survival guide. "Let them speak first," she added. I nodded slowly, even though she couldn't see me. That night, I prepared my phone settings carefully, activated call recording, tested it twice, saved the recordings into a secure folder. If they spoke, I would listen, not as family, as evidence. 2 days later, the call came. I was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing the loan timeline again when my phone lit up. Margaret Whitmore. My mother-in-law. I stared at the name for a moment, my pulse steady but alert. Not fear, not panic, control. Before answering, I tapped the record button. Then I pressed accept. Her voice came through sharp and familiar. "We haven't received the transfer yet." No greeting, no hesitation. Just expectation. "I've been reviewing my finances," I said calmly. My voice sounded unfamiliar to my own ears. Controlled. Neutral. Careful. "Well, make sure it's sent today," she replied quickly. "Same amount as always." Same as always. The phrase felt heavier now than it had in the courthouse parking lot. But I kept my tone steady. "I'm trying to understand some things first," I said slowly. "There have been changes." She sighed impatiently. "You've always handled this. Just do what you normally do." Not once did she ask how I was doing after the divorce. Not once did she ask if I was financially stable. Her concern was never about me, only the money. I listened carefully, saying very little, allowing her words to fill the silence. That was when it happened. The slip. "You know how much your help meant when we bought the lake house," she said casually. Lake house. My breath caught silently. That was the second property, the one I had only recently discovered in the documents. She continued speaking without realizing what she had revealed. "If we hadn't had your support, none of this would have been possible." My fingers tightened slightly around the phone. She had just confirmed everything. Not suspicion. Not theory. Fact. They knew. They had always known. And they believed I still didn't. The call ended minutes later. Her final words delivered with the same casual entitlement she had used for years. "Don't forget," she said. "Send it today." Then silence. I lowered the phone slowly and stared at the screen. The recording icon blinked softly. Evidence saved. Proof secured. For several seconds, I remained completely still, not shaking, not crying, just thinking. For years, anger had been my instinctive reaction whenever conflict appeared. Sharp words, emotional responses, immediate confrontation. But now, something inside me felt different. Quieter, stronger, strategic. I opened my notebook again and added a new entry to the timeline. Phone call recorded. Lake House reference confirmed. Mother-in-law acknowledgement logged. Each word written carefully, each detail preserved. Truth alone wasn't enough. Truth needed structure. Later that evening, my phone rang again. Linda's name appeared on the screen. I answered immediately. "I reviewed the documents again," she said. "Along with your recorded call." My chest tightened slightly. "And?" I asked. There was a brief pause before she spoke again. "We have enough to proceed." The words settled into place like the final piece of a long, complicated puzzle. Enough evidence. Enough proof. Enough truth. "But the next step," she continued, her voice steady, "will change everything." Silence followed. Then she added the words that made my pulse quicken. "We're going to confront them, officially." The conference room felt colder than the rest of the office. Even though the temperature hadn't changed, I sat at the far side of the long, polished table, my hands folded calmly in front of me, watching the door with quiet patience. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed faintly, filling the silence with a low, steady sound that made every passing second feel longer. Linda sat beside me, flipping through the organized stack of documents with calm precision. Every page was placed in order, every piece of evidence ready. Nothing about this meeting was accidental. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. Then the door opened. My ex-husband walked in first. Behind him came his mother and father. They looked exactly as they always had, confident, composed, slightly impatient. His mother wore her usual tight expression, lips pressed thin as if permanently prepared to criticize. And yet, as they stepped into the room, I noticed something else. They were smiling, not warmly, confidently, as if they believed they still controlled the situation, as if they believed this meeting existed to remind me of my responsibilities, not reveal their actions. "Let's not make this complicated," Margaret said immediately, taking her seat without invitation. No greeting, no acknowledgement, just demand. "We expect the monthly transfer to continue," she added. Her tone carried the same authority she had used for years, the tone of someone who believed obedience was guaranteed. I didn't respond. Instead, I watched them carefully, allowing the silence to stretch between us. My father-in-law leaned forward slightly, placing both hands on the table. "This is about family responsibility," he said firmly. "You've always understood that. Family responsibility. For years. Those words had shaped my decisions, guided my sacrifices, silenced my doubts. Now, they sounded hollow, outdated, empty. I glanced briefly toward Linda. That was the signal. She slid the first document across the table without speaking. The paper stopped directly in front of Margaret. At first, she glanced at it casually, barely interested. Then her eyes focused. Her posture stiffened. Recognition flickered across her face before she could hide it. She knew what it was. Loan documentation. "Proof," Linda spoke calmly, her voice steady and professional. "This document reflects a loan issued under Minnie's Holt's name without verified authorization." Silence settled across the table. My ex-husband shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening slightly. He avoided looking at me. Linda placed a second document beside the first. Property records, ownership filings, photographs printed clearly across the page. Margaret froze completely this time. Her fingers hovered just above the paper without touching it. That property, Linda continued, was purchased using funds borrowed under Ms. Holt's financial identity. My father-in-law's breathing grew heavier. A thin sheen of sweat formed along his forehead. The confidence that filled the room minutes earlier began to crack. Then Linda spoke the word none of them wanted to hear. Financial fraud. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything before it. No one moved. No one spoke. For the first time since entering the room, they had nothing to say. Linda reached toward the laptop sitting at the center of the table. She pressed a key. A familiar voice filled the room. Margaret's voice. "You know how much your help meant when we bought the lake house." The sound echoed clearly across the quiet room. Margaret's face turned pale. Her eyes widened slightly as recognition settled in. They were listening to their own words, used against them. Evidence they had created themselves. My ex-husband leaned forward suddenly, his voice sharp. "You don't understand how business works," he snapped. "You're twisting things." His tone grew louder with each word. Defensive. Desperate. "You don't know what we were dealing with," he continued. But his voice trembled slightly. Fear. The first time I had ever heard it in him. Linda remained calm, unmoved. She placed another document on the table. Signature comparison. 2 signatures side by side. One authentic, one forged. "These signatures do not match," she stated evenly. The truth sat there in plain sight. Impossible to deny. Margaret didn't look at me. She looked at her son. My ex-husband stared at the papers, his shoulders tightening as realization settled in. For years, he had controlled every conversation. Now, he had lost that power. I spoke for the first time. My voice surprised even me, steady. Controlled? Clear. "I trusted you." The words landed quietly, but heavily. "And you used that trust as collateral. No shouting. No tears. Just truth." They didn't interrupt. Didn't argue. Didn't dismiss. Linda leaned forward slightly, her voice firm but measured. "We will be proceeding with formal review of all related financial activity," she explained. "This includes asset tracing and liability evaluation." Legal language filled the air. Structured. Precise? Final. Margaret's hands trembled slightly where they rested on the table. My father-in-law sat completely still, his earlier authority gone. My ex-husband stared at the documents in silence. Defeated. For the first time since I had known them. They looked uncertain. Small. Power had shifted. And they knew it. The meeting ended quietly. No shouting. No dramatic exits. Just silence. One by one. They stood. Margaret avoided my eyes as she gathered her purse. My father-in-law moved stiffly toward the door. My ex-husband paused before leaving. He turned back slowly, meeting my gaze for the first time since entering the room. His expression carried something unfamiliar. Not anger. Not arrogance. Fear. "This isn't over," he said quietly. The words were meant as a warning, a threat, but they no longer carried power. I held his gaze without flinching. Inside, calm settled deeper than ever before. No fear. No doubt. Only clarity. "No," I thought silently. "It's just beginning." The morning sunlight slipped quietly through the blinds, laying soft lines across the kitchen counter as I stood there holding a warm cup of coffee. For weeks, mornings had carried tension, tight shoulders, restless thoughts. The quiet fear that something else might collapse beneath me without warning. But this morning felt different. Still. Peaceful. No phone ringing. No demands waiting. No voices expecting something from me before I had even finished my first sip of coffee. For the first time in years, silence didn't feel threatening. It felt safe. I sat at the small kitchen table in my temporary apartment, the same place where I had reviewed timelines, studied loan records, and prepared myself for confrontation. But today, the stacks of paperwork were gone. Only a single envelope remained. Certified mail. The return address read Linda Carver's office. My fingers traced the edge of the envelope slowly before opening it. Even now, my pulse quickened slightly, not from fear, but anticipation. This letter held answers. Final ones. I tore the seal carefully and slid the contents out. Several pages. Formal. Structured. Official. I began reading. The words felt unreal at first. Verification of unauthorized signatures. Confirmation of financial fraud. Release of liability. Each phrase carried weight, not heavy like fear, but steady like relief. By the time I reached the final paragraph, my vision blurred slightly. Not from panic. From release. The loans were no longer attached to my name. Legally removed. The debt that once threatened to swallow my future had been stripped away from my identity. I lowered the papers onto the table and exhaled slowly, pressing my hand against my chest as a deep, unfamiliar feeling settled inside me. Freedom. Not loud. Not dramatic. Quiet. Earned. For a long moment, I sat there without moving, letting the reality settle into place. My future belonged to me again. Later that afternoon, Linda called to confirm the remaining details. They've begun reviewing the property transfers, she explained calmly. Your former husband and his parents are under financial investigation. Her tone remained professional, measured, no celebration, no gloating. Just facts. They'll be required to account for every transaction, she added. For the first time, they were the ones answering questions, not demanding answers from me, not expecting obedience. Accountability had shifted direction. After the call ended, I stood by the window and watched the neighborhood outside. Children rode bicycles down the sidewalk. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Ordinary sounds filled the air. Normal life. Peaceful life. Life that didn't revolve around financial pressure or silent obligation. A week later, I walked into a small house for the first time, one I had chosen myself. Not large. Not extravagant. But quiet. Bright sunlight poured through wide living room windows, illuminating the empty space with soft warmth. The walls were neutral, clean, untouched by anyone else's expectations. This one feels right, the real estate agent said gently. I nodded. It did, not because of its size or appearance, because of what it represented. Ownership, control, choice. That evening, I carried the first box through the front door and stepped inside alone. No one followed. No voices filled the rooms. No demands echoed down the hallway. Just stillness. I placed my keys onto the kitchen counter. The sound of metal touching wood echoed softly through the room. Simple. Clear. Final. No one else held a copy of that key. No one else controlled access to this space. For the first time in years, I controlled my own door. Days passed quietly as I unpacked small pieces of my life, dishes, books, framed photographs that reminded me of who I had been before everything became complicated. One evening, as I sat alone on the couch surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, my phone buzzed softly on the coffee table. A message. From him. We need to talk. I stared at the screen for several seconds. Years ago, that message would have controlled my entire day. It would have sent anxiety rushing through my body, forcing me to respond immediately. Now, it felt distant, irrelevant. I placed the phone face down without replying. Not out of anger. Not out of revenge. Out of clarity. Some conversations no longer deserved my attention. Later that night, I sat quietly in the living room, the only light coming from a small lamp in the corner. The house felt peaceful. Still. Safe. I leaned back into the couch and closed my eyes, allowing memories to surface. Years of financial strain. Sleepless nights. Silent sacrifices I once believed were acts of loyalty. Helping family had once felt like love. But surrendering yourself wasn't love. It was survival without boundaries. And boundaries, I had learned, were not cruelty. They were protection. They were strength. Weeks later, I reviewed my new financial plan at the kitchen table, carefully built budgets, savings goals, retirement timelines that now belonged only to me. Numbers felt honest again, predictable, trustworthy. For the first time in years, I trusted my own decisions without hesitation. That night, I stepped outside onto the small front porch and listened to the quiet sounds of evening settling across the neighborhood. Wind brushing through trees, distant laughter drifting through the air. Peace. Real peace. Not the fragile version I once believed existed, but the kind built from truth and boundaries. I thought about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the deception, the moment I nearly lost everything, and the moment I chose to stand still instead of falling apart. Sometimes the hardest thing to rebuild isn't your finances. It's your confidence. Trusting yourself again. Believing your voice matters. Understanding that kindness should never require sacrifice without limits. That night, as I locked my front door and placed the keys beside me, I realized something I had never fully understood before. Confidence, once reclaimed, cannot be stolen again. And if you've ever found yourself in a situation where your kindness was taken for granted, where your trust was used as currency, where your silence felt safer than speaking up, I want you to know something. You are not alone. Many of us have stood in that same quiet place, rebuilding, questioning, learning how to stand again after someone crossed a line we never thought they would. If any part of this story felt familiar to you, if you've ever had to rebuild your life after betrayal or set boundaries that others didn't understand, I'd truly love to hear your story. Share it in the comments. Because sometimes the strongest healing begins when we realize others have walked the same road. And if stories about resilience, justice, and reclaiming your life speak to you, stay with this channel. There are more stories waiting to be told, more truths waiting to be shared. And sometimes, the next story you hear might be the one that reminds you just how strong you really are.